version, or you want?
Welcome and good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Center for Heirs Property Preservation for our inaugural collaboration with the International American Museum located in Charleston, South Carolina for the Preserving Land and Legacy Lunch and Learn program this afternoon. The Center for Heirs Property is a nonprofit organization that was established in response to the overwhelming need to address heirs property issues, particularly in the Low Country where there has been an influx of development happening. Our mission is to protect heirs property and promote the sustainable use of land to provide increased economic benefit to the low wealth landowners through our legal and forestry education and services. As a part of the Center for Heirs Property Preservation Road to 20 efforts, this chat aims to drive three key narratives. One, the importance of families coming together to ensure land is kept. Two, discuss what can be done or should be done if a family has identified their land as heirs property. And lastly, key things to know about wills, family trees, and obituary writing. I want to start by introducing our knowledgeable panelists, including myself. My name is Brianna Jackson. I'm the Director of Legal Services for the Center for Heirs Property Preservation.
Hello, I'm Monica Graves. I am the Outreach Alliance and also a formal client of the Centers for Heirs Property. And I'm covering the PD regional area with the Centers for Heirs.
My name, my name is Brian Sheffy. I'm the director for the Center of Family History here at the International African American Museum, and also the founder and host of Genealogy Adventures, the African American Genealogy and History TV show.
Hello, I'm Reverend Demet Jenkins, and I'm the former Director of Education and Engagement for Faith-Based Communities here at the International African American Museum, and currently the Faith-Based Consultant for the International African American Museum.
Thank you so much for introducing yourselves. So to lay out the framework of, well, what is heirs property in general? Heirs property is property that is still in a deceased person's name. And at the Center for Heirs Property, what we allow is free legal services to, one, help families navigate their heirs property issues, but also an extension of those services to landowners that are interested in utilization through our forestry program. One of the main things that I see, or issues that arise with families, is identifying, one, do they have heirs property, but also who are all of the heirs associated with that property. So today we do have panelists that have resources to help us identify who those heirs are, but also how do we go about using obituaries to ensure that all of the heirs are acknowledged to help navigate that legal process. One thing that I do think is very important is, although we have a lot of technical information going along, we want to have Monica also share her personal story to make sure that there is some context between what we do. So Monica, if you could please share your experience through your land.
Thanks, Brianna. Yes, so the Centers for Heirs Property, I actually searched them out as a former client with the Centers for Heirs. About in 2015, we had my mother, basically, she didn't want anything to do with the property. So I wanted to keep the legacy. So I actually gave up my job that I was, currently working, to come home to utilize the land and also resolve the issues that was there as far as the legal part of things. Once that was resolved, the Centers for Heirs helped me out with a will. At the will clinic in Orangeburg County, I went there to formalize my will once the land was passed down to me. Then I just didn't want that family land to not be utilized, because my father worked so hard to attain the 80 acres of land that we have. So one thing that the center did was they educated me and also put a light on the things of how to keep the land. And with the will clinic, of getting the will, knowing what you're going to be doing after the property is in your name. And another thing is with the technical support of, once you have the property, the center has a program where the forestry program could come in to help you utilize that land to make a profit on that. So that's how the center actually helped me in my personal experience.
Thank you, Monica. And so just to dive in a little bit about what is a will. A will is a legal instrument, and it is a writing where an individual gets to designate all of the property that they own and who they would like to transfer it to. And so it's very important that in understanding what you have as a family or as an individual, how you can protect that legacy through a will. As Monica stated, we do wills clinics throughout the year, as well as in our offices. The Center for Heirs Property has offices in Charleston, Orangeburg, Florence, and we have an upcoming office in Columbia. One thing that I want to highlight is the members of these conversations to have that's very important with the family is understanding your family tree and how it relates to resolving your heirs property matter. So Mr. Sheffy is going to highlight a little bit about how to obtain those family documents and resources to assist the family in navigating those documents.
Well, thank you for that introduction. So the basics that you really want to do is, I would suggest sitting down with the older members of your family, because you want to get the names, and keep in mind, You are building a link in a tree or a line, however you want to think about it, from you to the person who links you to the heir's property land. There's no point in collecting records or documentation for anyone else other than the direct line that connects you as an heir to the property that's in your family. One of the ways that you can actually organize all the materials that you're going to be collecting, and I'll get into that in a minute, is a family tree. And there's loads of places where you can actually build one. There's software that you can download, there's Roots Magic, and there's also something called Family Tree Builder. Both of these are paid. The first one, again, is Roots Magic. The second one is Family Tree Builder. There's also a myriad of solutions you can use online to also build family trees. There's Ancestry.com. That's a paid service. They do have a free service. It's quite limited. At some point, you're going to have to cough up some money. There's also FamilySearch.org, where you can also build a family tree. That's a free service. And there's Tribal Pages, which, depending on how large your family tree gets, you may have to pay $25 a month. So basically, with the family tree, you start with yourself. Then you add your parents. And one of the first records you'll want to have is a birth record. So you have to prove who your parents are. And the only way, there's a couple of documents where you can do that, but a birth certificate is one of the best. Same with your parents. To prove who their parents were, you're going to need to get a birth record of some kind. That could be a birth registry, it could be a birth certificate. Something else that people aren't really aware of is something that's called a delayed birth certificate. And I'll use a quick example. So I had a maternal grandmother, Pauline Matthews, who was born in Edgefield, South Carolina in 1911. Back then, there were no hospitals or in and around Edgefield. And even if there were, because she was a Black woman or she was a Black baby, her mother wouldn't have been allowed to give birth in a hospital. So in comes midwives. Most African Americans, especially those of us born in the rural parts of a state, would have a midwife who delivered one of our ancestors. Sometimes they were really good at filing those papers. Sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they forgot, or it could be a month or two late. It also depends. You have to be very careful and know when a state mandated birth, death, and marriage records. South Carolina didn't start mandating those until the early 1920s. Not all of the counties complied. Edgefield was the last. I think Edgefield complied at about 1925. So if your parents or if your ancestor was born before a state collected birth certificates, they would have a delayed birth certificate. So at the age of 62 in Washington, D.C., my poor grandma had to travel all the way down to Edgefield because there was no family member apart from a sibling that could verify who she was in Washington, D.C. She had to come down here, grab some really old cousins, went down to the courthouse. The cousins did their affidavits that Pauline Matthews was a daughter of Effort Matthews and Gertrude Harling, and that she was born around 1911. So she delayed birth certificate, which was filed at the Edgefield courthouse. Now, some of us are the children of the diaspora, so it may have been more. So if someone's ancestor was living in, Philadelphia or Baltimore, there's probably a high chance that they filed their delayed birth certificate in New York, Philadelphia, those kind of places. So that's birth certificates. Marriage certificates, which may or may not also have the names of people's parents on them. South Carolina is a bit inconsistent about that. Also death records, death certificates, death registries. All of those collectively are what we refer to as vital records. You want census records. You need to see where the person who links you to that land was living in different census records. You can see their siblings and their parents. Also military records, World War I, World War II draft cards. For men, these are really important because sometimes that's the first time we get a full birth date. And if the men were young enough, they were living with the parent. That's the part where, there's a question, who will always know where you live? They would put a mom, a dad, a sibling, someone. So military records are really important. If the person who links you to that land is like right after slavery ended, so the 1860s, try to see if they have a United States colored troop pension applications. They go into great depth about people. They may provide details about a spouse, children, parents, siblings, the lot. Demet is going to talk a lot more about obituaries and funeral programs, but again, those are important. Newspaper obituaries, funeral programs, church obituaries. They tend to always name other family members. That's another form of proof that links you up that line. Family Bible records. Um, Family Bibles can be absolutely crucial, especially again, if the person, the original landowner that you descend from, got that land in the 1860s or 1870s. Specifically, you need to find who has your family Bible. That can be a trip in and of itself. You also, but the reason why I'm suggesting family Bibles is a lot of them will have birth, marriages, and deaths in them. Those names are really important. And one of the things you want to look at, if someone is listed in the Bible as being born in like 1840, but is written in ballpoint pen, that's probably not going to be a valid entry because that was obviously entered much later. It wasn't entered at the time that that child was born. So I think that that's probably something that would be contested in court. I would also suggest looking at land records. Again, FamilySearch.org has wonderful, it's called a catalog. It breaks everything down by county and by state. And for instance, Charleston land records on Family Search, awesome. You get deeds, you get land plat maps, everything. So those are the big ticket kind of items.
Thank you so much for sharing that, especially regarding some of the challenges the families may face and how they can overcome them. Just a follow-up question before we move on to Ms. Jenkins. What are some best practices for maintaining and protecting those types of vital records and Bible records?
So with the really old records, and thank you, that's a great question. One of the best surefire ways of preserving and protecting them, they're called acid-free boxes. You can also wrap them up in acid-free paper. So you can buy them pre-made, or you can go online and you can order them and you can actually make them at home. It's kind of fun to do. Actually, again, it's a really cool way to involve your kids. If your kids like arts and crafts, I've got a staff member called Whitney, get her building all, the boxes for documents as well as Bibles. And we giggle about it in the office. Oh, it's an arts and craft kind of day.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
And Ms. Jenkins, just to go through your line of work, I do want you to also tell us the key elements of obituaries and how it plays a role in heirs property resolution and building that family tree.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for that question. So when we think about the obituary, we want to think about obituary and then funeral program. They're like two different parts to it. So the obituary is what we write about the person. So the funeral is about a celebration, right? It's about celebrating the life of that person. And so what we often don't do is to tell the story of that person's life from birth until death. Oftentimes you'll see the obituary begins with they were born to Mary and John, and they go straight into their adult life as if where were they raised, what schools did they attend. We don't name those things, so we're not really telling the life of the person. But so it is important for us to do that so that we are naming those schools. So when it's a historical document and it's a legal document, right? And we often don't see the obituary as such. And so if we can do that, then we will remember to name the people who that person is related to biologically. Oftentimes, culturally, in African American cultures, family members are raised in the same household, right? They may be cousins, they may be a friend, or maybe a neighbor's child, but they were raised in that home. And oftentimes, we'll put them as a sibling, and because they were raised that way. But we need to find the ways to say it very lovingly that they're not a sibling, but they were raised as a son or daughter, because it is a legal document. And when it comes to heirs property, if that person is listed as a son or a daughter, then legally they will have to be considered a son or a daughter based on the property, heirs property. So we just have to be really clear about how we're naming people in the obituary, how they are related. And we can always make people very special. You don't have to say where they weren't a part of the family, because they were. We just need to say that in a way that it distinguishes that they weren't biological, but they were still considered, right? You know, a son, a daughter. So we just need to be very mindful of how we write the obituary and remember that it's both historical and a legal document.
Understanding some of those awkward conversations or
Very
just
awkward.
those tough conversations.
Yes.
My next question would families or should families consult with the legal professional when drafting these obituaries?
So, you know, you would probably get people to saying, absolutely not. We know everything about our family. But if there are stepchildren, step siblings, half siblings, half aunts, you know, if you have a lot of that, which oftentimes, you know, a mother or father may have had children before several marriages, or children became blended as a part of a new marriage, it may be necessary to have that conversation so that we know exactly how to name people and how they're connected. I have a maternal grandmother who was married 4 times, and there were children in each of those marriages. So I never saw her obituary, but I was wondering who wrote it and what was said and how was it said. Because, you know, people, as a culture of people, we're very private. We don't like to put our business out, right? And so did they even name that she had 4 husbands and these were the children of those 4 husbands and the blended children that came within those marriages? So I think it's necessary when you have a lot of people who were raised in a house that weren't biological, and when you've had a lot of children from several marriages. I think it would be necessary to consult an attorney just to make sure that we're accurately naming families accordingly. Yes.
I actually have a question that stems off of something that Demet just said. So, say for instance, I'm thinking the most sensitive way of putting this. I discovered through DNA testing that I'm an outside child of someone of like a heir's property holder. How would that affect my claim? So there's nothing on paper actually proving that I'm of someone who's an heir's property holder, but I discovered that through DNA, and I actually want to make a claim on that land.
So, just as you stated in the narrative, as far as like vital records, all of those things are used as supporting document. So, even for as you were going through, you know, expansive family trees, it's just like knowing someone's history in that maybe they had children before they got married or through several marriages. And so, at that point, you are incorporating all of the moving parties in this heirs property. And again, when it comes to heirs property, especially when you're working outside of a will, those fractional interests just continue to spread regardless if you're the biological legally adopted child or an outside child outside the union. You're still fall into that category as biological. And so to piggyback off what you were saying, just knowing one, that legal professional can go into detail like, hey, words mean things and titles mean things, and understanding that even with heirs property, we have heirs that have decision making power, but their children are descendants, meaning they don't have any rights to stand on at this point in time. So in learning more about the work that you all do, it really makes it important to make sure that the heirs are at the table making these decisions so that they can have success stories like Monica on, hey, we were able to resolve our heirs property, opportunities through forestry on how to utilize it. My last question kind of touches on what steps should be taken after the obituary is published to manage and protect the land.
Yeah, I think that you know, if we have to go to probate, if a will is not written, you know, oftentimes, you know, I work in the healthcare system as well, and oftentimes people are having the conversations outside of the ICU waiting room when their loved one is now in the hospital and may not even have the capacity to have any cognition to speak, and now they're in a conversation about where's the will, you know, who owns what property, where are the deeds. That's not the time to begin those conversations. It's actually too late at that point. So we have to really think about How do we have these conversations? We meet for family dinners on a regular basis. We have family reunions. We have family gatherings. We've got to have those conversations in those gatherings, and we've got to figure out where are these documents located. Because if we don't, then it does get messy. It does get complicated. And what people don't always realize is there's so many generations that it goes back. So you think only grandmama owned that property when in fact grandmama got it from her grandmother, and so on and so on. So there's so many hands and so many people connected and involved. So, I think there was a question about should we list property ownership or heirs property in the obituary? And that's not been done. And so, how does that happen? If that were to happen, what would that look like? How do you name that? And I think that would be a very complicated process. Impossible? I don't know if it would be impossible, but it's not been done. And if family members have not had those conversations about the property and heirs and all of that, then putting it in an obituary before people have had the conversation causes division. And so we just have to encourage our families to be in conversation with each other and not wait until there's a crisis in the household to then ask those questions.
Thank you. To your point, I believe these topics are avoided just because I don't want to talk about death. I don't
That's
want
right.
to talk about loss. But
That's
the
right.
thing is, you're talking about more than a loss. You're talking about a legacy and
Right.
so much life that's still you're able to experience.
Absolutely.
And so when we're talking about heirs property, we're talking about building the family tree, you're telling your story that no one else has because it's individual to your own.
That's right.
But also when you're navigating heirs property issues in a legal form, that's what the judge wants to see. The
That's
judge
right.
wants to see the story. The
That's
judge
right.
wants to see how the land evolved from
right.
the people that actually have rights to
That's
it.
right.
So
That's right.
definitely that is very intriguing.
Yes.
But
Yes.
to both of you all, especially you, Monica, if you have any additional resources that either in person in the South Carolina area or virtually, what are some great partnerships for families to one, start developing their family tree, or just mechanisms that allow them to, I don't know how to host a family meeting, I don't know how to break the ice. What
Mhm.
would be your suggestions on doing that?
No, I think people do it informally anyway. Because like, well, Mama, now how many brothers and sisters did you have? Where did they live? So you're already sort of involved or engaged in those conversations. Somebody just needs to be note taking, right? Whether that's we've got all these devices now, so you don't even have to write anything down. You can record it, but we do that anyway. We're just not notating and documenting that information. So we need to be doing that so that we know, who are the siblings. I'll give you an example. My mother's side of the family just had a family reunion, and it was the first one, so not quite a reunion, more of a gathering. But again, my grandmother was married 4 times. So of course the shirt had all the last names of all of her husbands. And so trying to figure out, and then some of the children were in foster care and they were raised by other people who they considered their mothers and fathers. So it's very complicated to write it all out, right? But we got to write it all out because as we gather, some of them didn't even know, well, who is my biological mother's siblings? They didn't even have that information. And so for them to understand what they're connected to, what heirs of property they may be even a part of, you have to know the family history, the family tree. And so we just have to have those conversations and we've got to write that out. I mean, you gave some good examples of places where we can start that tree. And we need people to actually begin to do that because otherwise it's a lot of unknowns. And people go to their grave not really knowing who their family members are or how they're connected to a particular tree.
Did anyone else have anything to add?
Well, I was also going to say it's really probably a good idea to research the original landowner because I guarantee you there's a story behind that. Not every African American, especially those coming out of slavery, could own land or could own land. So the fact that some of our ancestors did and were able to pass that land down. There's a story behind that.
Interesting you said that, Brian. I'm not sure if most people are aware that even going to the Register of Deeds office and pulling that deed, some of the deeds have whereas clauses where it goes through a recitation of family members, who they left behind, or even an estimate of when they passed away. So that definitely could be a springboard to some of that research online. Monica, did you have anything to add?
Oh, I don't really have anything particular to add, but these are all good ideas on how to get someone to sit down. Normally, most of the time, people go to like the granny house or the big mama house, or family reunions or things of that nature. And some people, they just don't know how to set that up, like how to navigate that conversation, because it's a delicate conversation. So I would just say, like, if you're going to have that conversation, have someone that is a neutral person that could help you facilitate those difficult questions, because sometimes when you have it within the family, they were like, well, why you gotta facilitate that, because you always facilitating something. But it's the thing of just trying to come to a neutral agreement, because you don't want, like you were saying, it's too late when you're in the hospital and you can't have any cognate of what's going on. That is a real issue. Also, once you're trying to get it together and saying, okay, this is what we're talking about, this is what we need to talk about, to formalize what we need to put in place for the future of our legacy. Because if you're having a conversation, you're arguing all the time, and then someone can approach that other family to get their share and they not be part of your family. So that is a thing that you need to have these difficult conversations, because you don't want someone that's not your family in your family handling your family business. So that's what I would add.
Thank you. I would like to give a brief plug for the Center for Heirs Property Preservation. We also conduct seminars and outreach events that help equip families with the knowledge to know and identify, do they have an heirs property issue? Who are their family members? Who should they invite to the table to discuss some of these things? And so it's very important that you utilize this conversation, this panel, not only for the wealth of knowledge today, but going to our website, going to the African American Museum's website to do that extra work, because this is just going to be a springboard for a lot of families.
Absolutely.
And so please understand that it is a journey, and it is important to have that 100% agreement amongst family to prevent future land loss for landowners.
I think the only thing that I want to add, and I'll give the mic to Brian, is that there are families that live on the heir's property without knowing who all is connected to that heir. And they believe because they pay the taxes on it that they're the primary owner. And that's a conversation we have to have as well, because just because you paid the taxes does not mean that you're the primary owner. There's so many other folks who maybe they don't even know that they have that land, but they have a percentage of it. So we've got to have these conversations in our faith communities, at our family reunions, and any forums where people are gathered to talk about that, because there's an assumption around, because I paid the taxes or we paid the taxes, that we're the owners, not realizing there's so many other heirs.
Correct.
And I was going to say, in South Carolina, you're spoiled for choice in terms of where to go to find records. So, for instance, you can visit here at the IAAM, the International African American Museum, where researchers can, through our databases, help you find the records that you need. There are family history centers sponsored by the Mormon Church. There's one in West Ashley. I believe there's a few others in South Carolina. Then every county has a historical or genealogical society, plus a library. All of these places usually have access to, free access to ancestry and other kind of genealogy databases where people can go and find these records.
Thank you. At this time, if there's any questions, please put them in the chat. We would love to answer them for you.
Okay, so we had a few questions in the chat. This one's a two question. So the first person said, what role does oral history have to confirming property transfer? And does one have to notarize an oral history or auto recording, naming the relation and will to pass the land?
So unfortunately, land is transferred through a deed, and that's a written document that has to be recorded at the Register of Deeds office. And so oftentimes with families, we do look for a deed that is on record. Sometimes there may be a loss of that deed. And so maybe we only have a plat. And so doing the research with that plat and then springboarding onto the other additional family property tree and obituary helps figure out the landscape. But when there isn't a deed, it is very difficult to state orally just because transfers do not happen that way. Well, land transfers, I should specify.
Okay, and the next question, it was, how do cousins/children of sibling heirs who jointly own property handle relation conflict to have those conversations?
Ooh, legal joint. As far as tenants in common, so heirs property is a tenants in common form of ownership, which means that they share in the whole. Typically, when we hear joint, it could be 50-50. So I own 50%, my cousin owns 50%. A lot of things that happen on property needs 100% authorization. So that agreement is necessary. But also, when it comes to disputes, what is important is that that dispute doesn't end in land loss. And so mediation is always a good form of communication when it can't happen with those initial parties. At the center, we do allow for such services, but also there's other organizations such as South Carolina Legal Services, the Charleston Mediation and Meeting Center, but there's also mediation centers throughout the state in the Midland area and upstate.
Last one, it was, do you have recommendations on how to approach these conversations based on sibling order and gender dynamics in the larger and older generation?
That's a really good question. Because it's extremely sensitive. It's sort of like you're walking on eggshells, but it's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
So by not having it, you further are away from finding out the necessary information that you have to have. So, you know, whomever is the person in the family that helps to bring people together, you might want to call on them because they have that already, that the knack to gather and to bring people in the house together. So if that's over food is generally universal and keeps people calm. So we usually try to eat and have these conversations, but I think it's necessary for, you know, for us to have them. Like there's got to be somebody who has to take that initiative.
Mm-hmm.
And based on who your family dynamics, you know your family better than anybody, whether you need a mediator there, somebody who can keep people calm. So you have to know the dynamics of your household, your family household. So if there's somebody in the community, if there's a clergy person or somebody to help keep calm and peace when we're approaching these sensitive subjects, you may want to bring them to that conversation, but not avoid it.
And the only other thing I can add to what Demet just said is probably doing it in a neutral space. So not someone's home, but a neutral space.
Yes, I agree.
As far as characteristics, patience, empathy, but also grace. Just because I think it's important that we understand that culturally, this is an issue that's affecting how we're able to build generational wealth. But also within our families, we have different cultures. So we have to respect each other's goals and desires for the property, whether you're living on the property or you've moved away for whatever historical reason. So I would say those are some good characteristics to come just with an open mind, open heart, and just a willingness to be on common ground regardless of the differences.
Are there more pressures from external parties trying to acquire a parcel of heirs property that where they don't have a biological connection? Is there parts of the state that are probably more hot for that than others? I'm specifically thinking of a family in Hilton Head who don't have the best family dynamic, and there's developers trying to play them off each other to be able to ultimately get their land. So do you find that there is regions in South Carolina where that kind of practice is more prevalent?
Yes, I think that to your point, coastal Carolina is a real hotspot for predatory development. But also, as we're seeing growth in the state of South Carolina, there's also a need to protect environmentally. And so sometimes we have to be cognizant of, the developmental pressures where heirs property owners are at risk if they aren't communicating with each other. But also in other parts of the state, especially the PD area, environmental pressures are pushing heirs property owners out. And without communicating with each other, it makes it easier for that loss to happen as well.
And then they offer a dollar amount to a family member. They think that that's a good dollar amount, and in fact it's not. It's way less than what the property is actually valued at. So you have to watch all of that. So that's why it's just necessary for us to be in these conversations with each other so that we're all on the same page and working together.
And although I am a lawyer, I am going to plug forestry. They have seminars, workshops that also talk about the predatory timber sales that happen. Oftentimes families do communicate that people knock on their door and they're like, hey, we can purchase your timber at this price.
That's right.
However, it's heirs property and they know the risk of buying timber off of heirs property is not going to be full value. So it's important that regardless if it's about just clearing the title and getting marketable title for your family, just understanding what products and goods that you could harvest from your land that could, springboard
Right.
more of your family to a place that you couldn't imagine initially.
Absolutely.
So yes, those conversations are
Yes.
extremely important. Those checks
Yes.
can come from anyone,
Yes,
actually.
absolutely.
Okay, another question. Do you provide assistance with services in Kershaw County?
Yes, we do. And so the Center for Heirs Property covers 28 counties in the state of South Carolina. We are expanding to an upstate pilot. So please view our website for more information about that. But we do service Kershaw County as far as outreach, legal, and forestry.
Okay, and then how does the partition laws affect heirs property in South Carolina?
So the Clementi-Pinckney Act is very important to discuss around these heirs property issues, but it is limited to partitions. So I think it's fair for me to explain what a partition is first and then dive into those protections.
Yes.
So a partition is basically a divide of the property. So you have a partition in kind, which is physical. You have a partition by allotment, buyout provision. So for instance, if we own property together, they want to keep the property, I want to sell, that is a partition by allotment. They're going to try to buy me out. And then you have a forced sale, also called a partition by sale. Those are the three partitions that invoke the Clementi-Pinckney Act. And so this act helps heirs property owners with a first right of refusal. So in the event that there is predatory development, someone transfer their interest to a corporation or any third party, the heirs have that right to purchase the property with that first right of refusal. But also within the act is the second buyout round for any other heirs that don't have an interest in keeping the property. You can still consolidate that in the family. You can still protect the legacy through there. Other protections would be fair market value if it is sold based on that disagreement of inability to get on the same common ground. It will be for fair market value. And so appraisers are a part of that process. And lastly, notice. And so before it was simply run in the newspaper, but we all know that is becoming a very lost art, reading the newspaper. And so notice is important that it also gets published, but there's a conspicuous sign on the property giving notice that this property is going before the court for these matters.
And I also wanted to add about trespassing. In South Carolina, we have the purple paint law. So if you have trees or you're trying to mark your boundaries, you can actually spray the purple paint on your property to say that this property is not to be trespassed.
All right. So I want to thank everyone for their questions that they provided online. I really appreciate the engagement. I also like to thank my beautiful and wonderful, talented panelists for joining us this afternoon. So again, thank you all for joining the Center for Heirs Property Preservation and the International African American Museum Center of Family History, and Reverend Dr. Demet Jenkins, a pillar in our community, as well as Brian Sheffy. Please make sure you follow all of their social media pages, including ours. And if you're interested in learning more about all of our services and the services here at the museum, visit the website www.iaamuseum.org. And for the Center for Heirs Property, it's going to be www.heirsproperty.org. Please subscribe to all newsletters, events. I know that several campaigns are upcoming, so please be on the lookout for that so that we can continue our work in servicing landowners and families. Thank you for allowing us to embrace your afternoon, and we want to continue to support and uplift the community. Thank you.